If Razer's Wolverine V3 Pro is almost perfect, then this cheap imitation is better? I mean, yeah, this £40 Xbox-style controller from Nyxi, the Master P1, is genuinely impressive and trades blows with the £200 Wolverine V3 Pro, so let me show you around this thing and point out where it excels and where it shows its price tag. The shell itself is a straight rip of the V2 Chroma, complete with RGB lighting separating the grips and the controls, although already we find a budget-borne quality issue. The RGB lighting is clearly just an LED at the top and bottom shining through the plastic channel, which means that it's visibly uneven in brightness. Of course, that's completely insignificant, but it's a sign of what's to come. One of the major wins here, though, are the joysticks. Both are Hall effect, meaning they use magnets instead of potentiometers, which means these joysticks will never drift. That's a significant advantage over basically every other controller, especially the stock ones. Of course, it isn't quite as fancy as the V3. The tips are permanently on there. Although I suppose with disassembly you could probably replace them, but I mean, they're definitely on the cheap feeling side, and as alluded to, they're non-replaceable, at least easily. What you see is what you get. Now they are perfectly fine, and I'm sure will last a decent amount of time too, but the V3 definitely has it beat there, with not only optional domed and taller concave tips, but outright better feeling rubber too. But also, for the price tag, it's really hard to argue. Something else that's Hall effect, and the one area where the P1 has the V3 dead to rights for realsies, is the triggers. These bad boys are also Hall effect, which means they should basically never fail. I mean, mechanically, especially if you drop the bugger, it can, but electrically, you should be good. They feel perfectly normal and nice and smooth, no real qualms there. They do match Razer in the locking function, complete with a tactile switch at the bottom of the actually fairly large travel compared to Razer's. I would argue that Razer's version is definitely more refined. It has less travel and a nicer click. Although, let's face it, the P1's triggers are 95% as good for under 25% of the price, and actually technically they're better, being Hall effect and all, so I think it's important to put the context in there. The bumpers though, those are definitely worse. They're fine, they actually feel kind of like stock bumpers, which is to say decent enough, but not quite as nice and clicky and tactile as the Razer version. The face buttons, that being ABXY, those are just conventional membrane switches. Again, they're pretty much the same as a stock controller, which means they're a little mushy and not quite as nice as Razer's Mecha tactile switches, which have a much higher actuation point for a bit of latency improvement and a very nice tactile click while still actually having a decent amount of travel, which this P1 obviously just doesn't offer, but again, for 40 quid, it's hard to argue that this isn't anything than good enough. The D-pad actually does have a more tactile feel, although it's a conventional cross layout rather than a sort of bowl, and it's still kind of mushy with a fair bit of travel. Again, it's fine, but not stand out. And while we're by the D-pad, I should mention that there's actually volume controls on the controller. You have a mute button on the front down at the bottom, and then volume up and down buttons where the headphone jack normally is. Sadly, that feature is missing here, although I can report that the volume controls work great even on Windows, which is a nice addition. Plus, if we go a little further back, you'll find another great addition, 2 extra buttons built into the grips. These are placed perfectly for my middle fingers. They feel pretty great, have a nice tactile click to them, and even have the option to mechanically lock them so that they can't be actuated by accident. For certain games, that might be pretty helpful. Of course, a number of other controllers, Razer included, offer 4 or more buttons back here, and I'll leave it up to you whether or not you'd actually prefer more. But I can say for sure that I found it honestly a little better to only have 2 back there, because, I mean, Stock, those buttons just aren't there, so it takes a bit of extra brain power to use them and know which one to press if you got more than one. And to be able to press the, one of the 8 buttons on like the PS5 controller I reviewed recently just took too much brain power. Maybe that makes me a bit of a smooth brain, but I kind of like the simpler nature of this setup. Interestingly, thanks to my open source latency testing tool, available at osrtt.com, link in the description, I can now do pretty accurate latency testing for controllers. So naturally I tested this one and compared it to the Wolverine V3 Pro. I tested both wired and wireless, with the V3 running in its 1000 Hz mode when wired too. Amazingly, despite the wireless dongle on the P1 feeling like the cheapest trash you can imagine, and literally like falling apart in my hands to reveal a completely unbadged microcontroller and blinking lights, and even wirelessly, the P1 was within 1 millisecond of the V3 Pro. That's frankly incredible. Of course, when wired, the V3 with a new firmware update that actually properly supports the 1000 Hz mode does run away with it, with just 14 milliseconds of latency compared to 18 on the P1, but still, that's really impressive performance from the ultra budget controller. And as for actually using the controller, well, I'm happy to report that that's excellent. The shape is spot on for my hands. The textured grips help, although I should note that it's only the front section that's actually textured rubber. The back is, the same continued pattern, but it's just molded into the plastic, not rubber. Although honestly, it's pretty hard to tell in the palm of your hands, so I think that's actually a pretty decent value trade-off. Honestly, this feels like just as good as a stock controller, and only the joystick tips make it kind of obvious that it isn't more premium than it is. Actually, gaming on it was a great experience, whether that was in FPS games like Siege, which admittedly I suck at, especially with a controller, or in more racing games like Assetto Corsa. It was a really nice time. This is an undeniably good value. At just £40 as of filming, this thing runs circles around basically anything else, including stock controllers. And while it doesn't quite match up to Razer's offerings, including the much cheaper V2 Chroma that I use personally, it's still at least half the price, if not a quarter, so I'd call that a great deal. One extra thing that I haven't yet mentioned either is that this actively supports not only Xbox and PC, but Nintendo Switch, Android and iOS. If you want to use this thing with basically anything but a PlayStation, you can. That only adds to the value proposition here. So if you're looking for an Xbox style controller and you don't have Razer money, I think you should get this. Of course, those are my thoughts, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the Nyxi Master P1? Is this a controller for you? Would you rather opt for something like the Razer ones instead, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments down below. I will leave a link to this in the description if you're interested, as well as links to both Razer controllers, the V3 and the V2 Chroma. And yeah, otherwise, that's pretty much it. If you want to see more videos like this one, you can hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon. Check out plenty of other videos on the end cards. And if you want to check out the open source latency testing tool that I use to test stuff like this, head to osrtt.com, linked in the description. Otherwise, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.